Hello and welcome to my presentation. My name is Rebecca Roberts and I will be presenting today on my paper titled The Propaganda Puzzle, Examining the Effects of Politicized Language. This piece is for my senior seminar in the philosophy of language, and it is a work in progress. So moving into a quick introduction and outline of my paper, first I'll be talking about my thesis. Following this, we'll move into theories of linguistic structure, which I am using as I feel they are relevant to what I'm trying to accomplish with this piece. I'll be focusing on Wittgenstein's theories of language games, which is really the most central theory for my piece, and also his theory of aspect perception and aspect blindness. After that, I will be moving into Grice and the cooperative principle. And following that, I will be moving into the theory of linguistic turns. I am focusing on a piece by HIRSHKOP. However, the theory of linguistic turns was introduced by previous philosophers to include Frege, Russell, and Wittgenstein. So it kind of ties it all together. Following that, I will be moving into more of the social theory and application to current politics, and I will be focusing more in the United States for purposes of my paper. So I'll be looking at the dangers of propaganda and the threat which politicized language poses to logic and reason when it comes to language. I will be looking at a piece by Kenneth Thompson, which focuses on language and social theory. And of course, I'll be looking at pieces by Chomsky, Propaganda in the Public Mind, Necessary Illusions, and also I'm including a couple quotes from the documentary titled Manufacturing Consent. Finally, I'll be moving into my conclusions and what I've drawn from all of this. Moving into my thesis, I'll just read it off for you. So, if all members of a society can participate in the game of language, then we can begin to prevent its corruption and set a basis for true equality. So currently in the United States, this so-called game of language, I am arguing, is not open to all to participate in. It is currently fixed by the elite and powerful, as proven by looking at who owns and influences most mass media in the United States, which was a big point that was driven in Manufacturing Consent, where Chomsky explains how mass media and these corporations are owned by even larger corporations, and they're in the hands of a small few of the elite and powerful. Moving on from this, however, the appearance of free speech, keyword appearance, allows for the continued success of propaganda and politicized language, preventing a fully inclusive version of language, and preventing the possibility of equality between all races, religions, and genders. So I highlighted, obviously, the word appearance of free speech because if you historically look at nations who preach on free speech and open language, typically that's not actually the case. It's kind of a front and creating a blindness to the actual reality of what's going on in that society, which we'll get into later on. So moving on from my thesis, we will now move into Wittgenstein and language games. This is really the most central theory to my paper. I'm looking at language through the lens of Wittgenstein and language games, and examining language as such. So rather than taking the typical approach, which is reductive in that philosophers will try to break down language for individual meaning of words and almost like looking at the grammar, I'm taking more of a holistic approach to language and looking at it as like this one big game. So in looking at language at a game, an important question is, what do all games have in common? And Wittgenstein asks this question in so many words, and basically comes to the conclusion that language is a game involving a complex and unfixed system of rules, which correspond to the context in which it is used. So there are no fixed rules, there's only the concept and the notion of what a game is. you can look at all kinds of different games, like say you're playing checkers, or you're playing a video game where, let's go with like Dance Dance Revolution. There's really no common rules that are fixed for those two different things. Instead, we just have this concept of what a game is, in that we participate in it. So the philosophical implications of this is that, one, it shows us that the traditional reductive approach to language is not productive, and this is why I am not taking that approach, because I do not feel that it is productive. Based on my research for this paper, I don't feel like it's productive to continue down that path of kind of nitpicking and breaking down language, when we should be looking at it as a whole thing in a game, and what does language do. Number two, this provides an account of the bigger picture of language, and understanding that the meaning of language is rooted in context and intent. So what does looking at what language does and why, basically. Next, I'm moving into that it demonstrates that language is inherently social. So in saying that it's inherently social, again, goes back to this idea of participation in language. So this leads me to the cooperative principle, which I will argue is the unifying principle for language games. The rules are not fixed, again, but they are fluid. What is fixed is that we cooperate in, and that we understand that the implication of language depend upon context. So moving into the cooperative principle, this is something that was introduced by Grice, but he drew it from Kant, and there exist 4 categories under this principle. Those 4 categories include quantity, quality, relation, and manner. For the purposes of my paper, I'm focusing on quality, as I don't feel the other 3 necessarily do what I need to do with this paper. So I will be focusing on quality, although relation and manner obviously are important to my paper as well. I'm sticking with quality. It's most relevant to the philosophical inquiries of this work, in that it argues that the contributions made through language must be true. So additionally, what I'm saying is that there's 2 principles under the cooperative principle, in which Grice and Kant argue that, 1, do not say what you believe to be false, and 2, the most important part that I'm focusing on, is do not say that for which you lack adequate evidence. So I think this is really relevant right now, especially with how media works, and especially with this big blow up of social media and the internet and this idea of fake news. I think it's really important to focus on this principle of do not say that for which you lack adequate evidence, because you look at how we communicate now and how we're so quick to react and say something without really doing the research on whether it's true or not. So in my paper, I will be using a case study of tweets from Trump, and I'll be looking at the claims that they make, and then looking at the lack of evidence behind certain tweets that he has made. However, I will be focusing on how, although there's a lack of evidence, why do so many people have a reaction and still believe this? They believe that these claims are true, not because of evidence, but because of something else. So that's something I'm going to be focusing on. So I'll be looking into examples of his claims, specifically in mid-March, that we conducted the most testing for COVID-19 out of any nation. And I'll also be searching back. I'm still working on this research right now to find very specific tweets that work for what I'm trying to say. So I'll also be looking at false claims that he has made about immigration and the Mexican border. So here I have just 2 quick little examples that I may or may not use in the paper. But the one is a tweet from Trump on March 25th about how he reported that the United States had done far more testing than any other nation. and that over an 8-day span, we did more than what South Korea did. I did a little bit of research into the actual numbers and found that this may not be true. We came close to the numbers in South Korea, but what he said was not really evidence-based. So I'll be looking at this as an example of do not say that for which you don't have sufficient evidence. Next, I also started looking into another example where Trump said that Americans will have access to vaccines, I think, relatively soon, and saying that it would be available over the next few months. Again, another example of saying something, but it's not evidence-based. It's more political. It's politicized language to kind of make people feel a certain way or believe something or support a political agenda. So I'll be looking into that a little bit more. These are still in the developmental stages of my paper, as I wanted to focus on theory first, and I'll be developing on these ideas more. So moving into Wittgenstein's theory of aspect perception. This theory says that the use of language alters what is called our inner world, and by altering our inner worlds, and our mind, basically, this alters our perception of the outer world. So in the case of aspect blindness, this is the inability to see a part of reality or to perceive our own biases. So essentially, we're not seeing the full picture, we're only seeing a part of it. So by politicizing language and creating propaganda, the media and those who influence it lead the general public to have a certain worldview. And this is how aspect blindness sort of is created through political language. Aspect blindness in turn prevents us from participating in the game of language because we're unable to fully understand the implications of language and how language and reality correspond. So in this case, I'm going to be using an example from Angela Davis in her unfinished lecture on liberation and her examination of Frederick Douglass as an example of aspect blindness. I'm also going to be examining a piece written by Stephanie Spoto, not sure the pronunciation, but it's titled Wittgenstein, Aspect Blindness and White Supremacy. In this work, she examines the problems of the white community and their blindness to, their whiteness, basically, and I can't think of the word right now. Their privileges. So, looking into the piece by Davis, I just included a quick page here from her unfinished lecture on liberation. I just wanted to read a quick paragraph from this, or rather explain it. Basically, in this piece, she's reflecting on Frederick Douglass, who, as a slave, was basically told that knowledge unfits a child to be a slave, so that knowledge isn't something that slaves should have. So sort of through this enlightenment, he kind of used it to turn against the master. So basically what the masters were doing with the slaves, and a big example was religion, was that they were giving them like a watered down, filtered version of religion. And so Davis explains that first, Douglass learns to educate himself. He legally learns to read. And through educating himself, he learns in a way that knowledge is power, and that this is how he's going to be able to liberate himself. And she's, looking at freedom and is man free? Are slaves free? Even as a slave, do you have the freedom as a person to choose between death or being a slave? Is that freedom or not? But anyways, I digress. Douglass is reflecting on learning to read, and then his knowledge and education being backed up by religion. So once he learns to read, he kind of accesses the full picture of religion, instead of this very narrow view of only what the masters and the whites that own the slaves want them to hear. And through education and seeing the full picture, relating this back to aspect blindness, he's no longer blind to the fact that religion gives him a basis for equality, that yes, all humans should be equal, and this is supported by religion. But he would not have been able to discover that unless he legally taught himself to read and eliminated that blindness. So I will be examining that. So next I'm going to be moving into HIRSHKOP and linguistic terms. So like I mentioned before, oops, let me get out of there. So like I mentioned before, the concept of a linguistic turn is not HIRSHKOP's idea himself, but the piece by HIRSHKOP, it was a full book and I'm using a couple chapters from it, really I feel like was very relevant to my paper in the way that he examined the linguistic turns. He focuses on one big linguistic turn from 1890 to 1950, as it was a big shift in the political atmosphere of really the world. So moving back into linguistic terms, it's a movement in the early 20th century which involved language, users of language, and the world. And it focuses on changing issues and conflicts at a larger societal level and how those are reflected in the use of language because it derives its meaning from context. So when the world is changing, that's the context, right? So when the world changes, the context of language changes, and therefore there's a turn in language. So that's why it's titled Linguistic Turns. So this idea was explored by many philosophers, as I mentioned before, including Frege, Russell, and Wittgenstein. And so basically when reality shifts, whether it's politically, socially, or whatever else, it alters the context and thus creates a linguistic turn. And rather than focusing on small little individual linguistic turns and kind of this reductive approach, HIRSHKOP was explaining to kind of look at it as one big thing, right? And that's why his piece focuses on one big linguistic turn from 1890 to 1950, because all those little things are part of really one bigger language game, you could say. So looking at changing the game, linguists claim that language has been of the people. This implies that because language is a collective activity, or as I would call it, a game, everyone can have a role in determining its substance. So here I just wanted to include a quick little quote by the HIRSHKOP piece. It is, of course, the reflective image of the problem facing democratizing nations. The political community of the nation was expanding until it included most of its adult citizens. Language was expanding so that it represented the speech of more or less the same group. It was this isomorphism that made it possible for problems in the political and social field to be represented and worked through as problems in the linguistic field. So basically here he is relating the expansion of democratizing nations and how this affects language and how we can examine political problems through examining linguistic structure and language, the use of language in democratized nations. And I thought this was really interesting because it's pretty much essentially what I'm trying to do with my paper in relating language to the United States, in this case, a democratized nation with this idea of free speech. Okay, more on philosophy and the corruption of language. So moving a little more into social theory here with Thompson. He examines the way in which politicians deceive their listeners and how political language aims to guide our perception of the world in a way which favors the interest of political parties. And so another quote, such language is not meant to engender consideration of issues, but rather to free them from the burden of consideration. This was one of the first quotes that I read that really struck me when thinking about my paper. This term of the burden of consideration I thought was really interesting. Because you look at propaganda and what it aims to do, and I would like to also include, once I get more into my paper, speech acts and some theories from Searle maybe. But thinking of language and propaganda and how it seeks to influence us, and it doesn't seek to necessarily make us think about, okay, why is this happening? Why do I believe this? Instead, it kind of forces it on you, and you don't have to consider it because the decision's already been made for you through propaganda and kind of this forceful approach. So looking at Thompson's social theory and how it correlates to the cooperative principle, on page 21 of this piece by Thompson, he says that words can be used to create fear without specifying any particular threat and to garner support where people have no compelling interest. So by creating fear where there's no threat, political language really violates one of the qualities that we spoke about earlier. If you recall, one of the principles under the cooperative principle was do not say that for which you lack inadequate evidence. So going back to the example of Trump and immigration, and you think back to the 2016 election and when he was saying the Mexicans are bringing racists and drugs and violence and creating this fear. But is it really based in evidence, or is it just eliciting an emotional response? So again, Thompson's ideas support this cooperative principle. And I will argue that this is an abuse of language, and any disregard for the cooperative principle may be called the corruption of language. And I really like to think about the cooperative principle in a way that Dr. Lund and I spoke about when we had a one-on-one for my paper. He had this example. He probably will have said it better than I'm going to say it now. But this example of when we used to have dial-up, and you think about how it would connect and make the hand shake. And that's kind of what language should be, right? We should make that handshake. And I think currently the state of language as it is now, we're not necessarily making that handshake. We're just kind of taking it and not really understanding all of the implications and the bigger picture. We don't see the full picture, so we really can't make a true handshake. And so this is what I'm going to argue is the corruption of language and the abuse of language. So another quote here from Thompson: in the political cases like those Orwell and Wilde describe, where the language of objectivity or of moral evaluation or of nationhood is widely and ambiguously used without the practices that would give it legitimacy, the voice of dissent is effectively silenced. There can hardly be any dialogue, for there can be no agreement about the meanings of important words or about any procedure for settling differences. I think of that like the cooperative principle, right? If there's no agreement about the meanings, then we're not cooperating. But in this case, only one side is really aware of what the meaning is, right? It is a possibility of finding one's way around in the geography of language, of identifying landmarks that makes it possible, the kind of dialogue, agreement, dissent that characterizes a stable and free society. Looking at this sentence, if you're saying that in order to find your way around this geography of language, you have to be able to do so, to have agreement and dissent, and to have discourse. If you don't know your way around or have a full picture of this sort of map of language, then you can't have that sort of discourse. So this is what is destroyed, as with taking down or changing street signs. Such uses of language rob people of their connection to the past, in this case their linguistic past, which would otherwise give them access to values and beliefs and a voice of dissent. So overall, I think of this quote as kind of driving home the point that to think clearly is really a necessary first step towards political change. I think that in understanding language and being able to eliminate any blindness, any aspect blindness, that's really the first step towards any sort of political change. And any reform of politics would mean that we also need a reform of language. You look at things like how laws are written, and how even if you look at certain laws, they still, reinforce ideas of white supremacy and privilege. That's something that I'm going to delve into a bit once I get further into my paper. But we really need a reform of language in order to reform politics, because the two really correspond. And in order to do that, we must participate. We must fully understand language and reality. Moving into Chomsky, I still have more work to do on Chomsky, a couple books I'm reading through right now. So I'm just including a couple quotes that I jotted down when I was watching Manufacturing Consent. The first was, "Propaganda is to democracy what violence is to dictatorship." So I think of that in that, what does it do? In a dictatorship, violence is used to enforce the political agenda of the government. So basically, if you make that comparison, propaganda does the same thing for democracy. It reinforces a political agenda for those in power and whoever is trying to drive this agenda. So the next one is, "It is a game for elites. It's not for the ignorant masses who have to be marginalized, diverted, and controlled." So I really apply this to the game of language. This game of language is for the elites, and currently in the United States, they are who are participating, and the majority of people are what Chomsky would call the ignorant masses, and kind of need to be educated and woken up to what is going on. Emotionally potent oversimplification provided by the myth maker to keep the ordinary person on course. So I think back to the case of Douglas, Frederick Douglass, and the slave and the master. So the myth maker is kind of like the master in this case. In the case of Douglas, you think of how was the master myth maker? Well, in giving them that diluted version of religion and in preventing them from being educated and able to think for themselves, they created this myth that they're meant to be slaves and nothing more, and that they are an inferior race, really. And also, I think it's really important to focus on the emotional part of this, because again, going back to do not say that for which you lack adequate evidence, a lot of what's happening is in politics right now is things are being said that are not based in evidence, but rather, again, promote fear where there's really no evidence to be afraid, and they elicit an emotional response rather than a rational response. So just some quick thoughts on Necessary Illusions, another book by Chomsky. Chomsky explains that if you look at a new journalist who's trying to enter into the world of journalism and to make their way, it's kind of like maybe they have these big dreams of changing things. Well, if you look at it in reality, they're really unlikely to succeed in making it in the world of journalism unless they conform to the system which is already in place. And I remember watching Manufacturing Consent and him talking about this, and I think one of the students asked him, "Well, how did you make it?" And he just said, "Well, I was lucky." I thought that was funny. But the current system serves the interests of the state and corporate powers, which limits discourse among the common man, and that's another thing. This is all explored in Manufacturing Consent, but I'm looking to explore it more in the text. But that if you look at all these news outlets and the media and who it's owned by, it really all stems to the same small group of people. So media really does not serve a societal purpose, not in the sense of democracy, right? Like we have this idea that in a democracy, media and politicized language and the politicians are supposed to represent the people, which to an extent maybe more so some politicians do. But if you're looking at it how it really is. You look at James Mill's conceived notion of the societal purpose of media, and that is state education. And the state education is to influence people to support the government, and, really like going back to the founding fathers, support this idea of democracy and those in power. It's really to keep social and political order. So in this sense, media is creating an aspect blindness, and they're skewing our worldview to be a certain way instead of being all-inclusive and allowing all to participate and really paint the bigger picture for what it really is. So moving into my conclusions, I'm sure I will have more conclusions as I get more work done on this paper, because I'm still kind of tying it all together. But language in its current state, I believe, is an exclusive and not inclusive game in which the elite and powerful use it to shape our worldview and create aspect blindness for those who are not participating, for those who are not the elite and powerful. If those which language does not currently represent in the U.S. are able to educate themselves and recognize their blindness, this can be used to begin to participate in and change the game of language in order to ensure that it accurately represents the world. And in this, I think back to the course I'm also taking with Professor Boudman on philosophy and race, and just something that really struck me in the beginning and was really profound for me was recognizing whiteness. And even for me, recognizing my own whiteness and the bias that it creates, and it's not intentional. It's how things have happened. And in recognizing that and how it's affected my life and my experiences, by being able to admit to that, I can move forward in changing and seeing the bigger picture and seeing how I might unintentionally contribute to the problem. And that's kind of a domino effect of change, I think, is recognizing this and kind of awakening ourselves to the bigger picture. So in order to ensure that all may participate in the game of language, users must be held to the standards of the cooperative principle. So I don't want to say that there are rules for the game, but if there is one common theme, as I've said from the beginning of this presentation, there's one common theme in games, and specifically the language game, it is the cooperative principle, in that we all need to participate. And that's what makes language a game. And I think that under this cooperative principle, specifically, it is essential to not say things that are not don't have sufficient evidence or research. So making sure that we're being factual and accurately representing the world through the way in which we use language. So that's all that I have for now. Like I said, this is a work in progress, so I'm sure that much of this will change, and I still have a lot of work to do on my paper. But I look forward to hearing your feedback on this, and thank you for taking the time to listen.